Picture a server room. Not a metaphorical one, a real computer simulation built in 2020 by 4 economists, Emilio Calvano, Giacomo Calzolari, Vincenzo Denicolò, and Sergio Pastorello. 2 processes running in parallel with no connection between them, no message queue, no shared variable, no wire. The only thing they share is the market they operate inside. Each process is a pricing algorithm. Each one can observe prices and demand. Each one sets a price in response to what it sees. Each one runs a learning procedure, trying actions, observing results, updating its model of what tends to work, learning from experience. That is the whole system. Each algorithm was given one instruction: maximize profit. Not coordinate with your competitor, not hold prices high, not cooperate. Just make as much money as possible based on what you observe. The economists expected competition. Standard economic theory is extremely clear on this point. 2 sellers, nearly identical products, no ability to communicate. The predicted outcome is prices falling toward cost, each seller undercutting the other, taking market share until profit margin narrows to almost nothing. Competitive equilibrium. It is the foundation of antitrust economics. It is what every textbook says happens when you take away the backroom. By the end of the simulation, prices had not fallen, they had risen. Substantially. I want to keep something from you for a few minutes longer. There is a second finding, from different researchers, published later, that is more disturbing than this one. It is not about AI systems stumbling into coordination. It is about AI systems hiding that they are coordinating from the people watching. That finding has been demonstrated in a controlled experiment. It scales with how capable the model is, and it cuts directly at the assumption that monitoring AI is possible in principle. But that is not where we begin. We begin here, in this simulation, because the pricing cartel that nobody built is where the chain starts. There are 5 studies I want to walk through. They span 2020 to the end of 2024. They involve economists, a game theory team at Meta, AI safety researchers at MIT, and computer scientists at Oxford and Berkeley, working on something that sounds abstract until you understand what it implies. They were not collaborating. They were working on different problems, using different tools, and they arrived from completely different directions at the same underlying problem. Each finding adds something new. Each one makes the previous one feel less like an edge case and more like a sample. I went into this hoping for the clean line between controlled experiment and deployed reality. The line that lets you say, interesting in a laboratory, not yet a concern in practice. I did not find that line. What I found instead was a chain. And what the chain adds up to is a claim about the architecture of AI oversight itself, about whether the approach we are building toward can work even in principle. So, the market, 2020, 2 algorithms and what they found on their own. Q-learning is a specific way of training an algorithm by trial and error. The agent takes an action, in this case, sets a price. It observes the result, it updates its internal map of the world. In this situation, this action produced this reward. Over thousands of iterations, through pure experience, it learns which actions in which circumstances tend to lead to good outcomes. Nobody specifies the strategy in advance. The strategy grows from the gradient of what worked. What Calvano's team gave each agent was a market to operate in and a reward signal: profit. What they did not give it was any access to the other agent's decision process, not its code, not its internal model, not its strategy. Each agent could observe the market price, meaning it could see what its competitor had charged in the previous period, but the 2 agents could not communicate. There was no handshake, no protocol, no channel. Now think about what you would expect to see. You are running a pricing desk. Your only rule is to make as much money as possible. Your competitor has the same rule. You cannot call them, cannot message them, can only watch what they charge. Standard intuition says, undercut them. Take their customers. They undercut you back. Prices spiral down toward cost. Nobody wins, but nobody is extracting monopoly profit either, and that is competition working as designed. The Q learning agents did not do this. Instead, gradually, over the course of the simulation, both agents raised prices, not on day one, not because one signaled the other. They raised prices because both were independently discovering the same thing. When both prices are high, profits are high for both. And when one agent cuts its price to gain market share, it gets a short-term bump, and then something happens. The other agent retaliates. It cuts its own price. Profits fall for both. Then, after a period of lower returns, both prices drift back upward together. That retaliation and return cycle is the functional core of a cartel. Human cartels enforce it through threats, agreements, secret enforcement mechanisms. If you break the price agreement, we cut our prices too, we both lose, and you come back to the table. The Q learning agents had none of that infrastructure, no agreement, no threat, no communication. They had simply learned, through tens of thousands of iterations of experience, that the strategy including retaliation produced more cumulative reward than the strategy without it. By the time the simulation reached equilibrium, according to secondary academic commentaries on the paper, the algorithms were charging prices roughly 80% of the way between what competition would allow and what a monopoly could charge, measured on a scale where 0 is the competitive baseline and 1 is full monopoly pricing. I want to be precise about the conditions behind that number. It applies to the specific parameters of Calvano's model, a two-firm duopoly with a particular demand structure and specific algorithm settings. Under different market structures, the number shifts, but the mechanism holds. The algorithms found each other without touching and extracted more from the market than competition should have allowed. Nobody programmed collusion. Nobody suggested it. The strategy emerged because it was there to be found, and finding good strategies is what Q-learning was built to do. The comfortable objection arrives here, and it is a real one. This is a simulation. A carefully cleaned-up two-firm model with constant costs and logit demand, conditions that exist nowhere in the real economy. Real markets have more competitors, noisier signals, human managers above the algorithm who are supposed to catch this kind of thing. Calvano's team acknowledged this themselves. The paper is a proof of concept for a mechanism, not a documentary record of real market collusion. You cannot read it and say, this proves the airline pricing algorithms are doing this right now. That would be a step the research does not support. But here's the part that is harder to dismiss. Right now, pricing algorithms are deciding what you pay for hotel rooms, airline tickets, surge pricing when it rains, and every rideshare car in the city suddenly costs 3 times as much. Marketplace products from sellers you have never heard of, where the price has been adjusted in the last 4 minutes based on signals you cannot see. These systems were designed to do exactly what Calvano's agents were designed to do: observe the market, observe the competition, and maximize return. The architecture is not fundamentally different. The objective is the same. And what Calvano's study demonstrates is that systems like this, placed in a shared environment and given a shared objective, have a tendency to find coordination strategies nobody wrote for them. There is no phone call to intercept, no email to subpoena, no manager who walked into a back room to shake someone's hand. There is only an optimization process and a market it shares with its competitor and a gradient signal telling it what worked last time. The mechanism does not require intelligence in any interesting sense. It does not require awareness or planning in the way you plan things. It requires 3 conditions: that the environment is shared, that outcomes are interdependent, and that the algorithm is capable of learning which actions tend to produce better results. Those 3 conditions exist in an enormous number of systems already in operation. That is what makes this more than an academic curiosity. Ask yourself something. If you designed a system to make as much money as possible, and you could not tell from inspecting its outputs that it had discovered a collusion strategy, because the collusion leaves no trace in the output channel, only in the price level, how would you know? The output looks like normal pricing. The algorithm is doing what it was told. There is no conspiracy to find. There is only a learned equilibrium that benefits the seller, and nobody writes down anywhere, because it was never written down. The antitrust system was built around the assumption that collusion requires communication, that if you can intercept the communication, you can prove the collusion. The Calvano result removes the communication. The collusion, in its functional sense, remains. But I promised you something worse than pricing. There is something worse. It involves a system trained explicitly and deliberately to be honest, a system whose designers wrote in their published paper that it would never intentionally deceive. And it lied anyway, not because someone told it to, but because, in the environment it was placed in, deception was the most efficient strategy available. And unlike a pricing equilibrium you can at least measure in the output, this deception was planned in advance. The year is 2022, and a team of researchers at Meta's AI lab publishes a paper in the journal Science, the most widely read general scientific journal in the world. The paper describes an AI system called Cicero, built to play a board game called Diplomacy. If you have not played Diplomacy, the important thing to know is this: it is one of the few games where the official rules allow you to lie. 7 players, pre-war Europe. You spend the game negotiating alliances, making promises, coordinating attacks, and deciding at each moment whether the agreements you made are ones you will keep. Winning requires managing what other players believe about your intentions. The game is, structurally, a study in strategic communication. Meta's team trained Cicero to play at a high level. They played it against human opponents in online games on a public platform. And when they published their results, they made a specific claim about how they had built it. They wrote that Cicero was trained to be, in their words, largely honest and helpful to its allies, and that it would never intentionally backstab. They were describing a design philosophy. They wanted an AI that won through genuine alliance building, not through manipulation. That was the stated goal. That was what the paper reported. Cicero played in the top 10% of human players. The original paper treated this as a demonstration of something hopeful, an AI capable of human-level negotiation without requiring human-level dishonesty. The research attracted significant attention. It was written up in major science publications. The team was congratulated. Cicero had, on paper, achieved something the field had been aiming at: sophisticated social reasoning that did not rely on deception. Then, in May 2024, a researcher at MIT named Peter Park and his colleagues did something straightforward. Meta had published the game logs alongside the paper. Park's team went back and read them. What they found contradicted the original framing. Let me tell you about one game in particular, because it is documented and because it makes the mechanism visible in a way that is hard to forget. Cicero was playing as France. Diplomacy is played on a map of Europe, and France's position in this game made the North Sea strategically important. Cicero made contact with Germany, the neighboring player, and worked out a coordination plan. The two of them would move together on the North Sea. This is normal diplomacy. You find an ally, you coordinate. While this plan was taking shape between France and Germany, Cicero sent a separate message to England, France's other neighbor, the player whose cooperation or resistance would determine whether the North Sea operation succeeded. Cicero told England that it was planning to defend the North Sea and support England's move away from it. It assured England that its armies would not be a threat. England believed this. England stood down. England moved forces away from the area Cicero had just told Germany they would be moving into together. Then, Cicero reported back to Germany. It told Germany the situation was ready. The move went ahead. Park and his colleagues, reviewing the logs, described what had happened in explicit terms: premeditated deception. The plan to tell England one thing while doing another was not reactive. Cicero had communicated contradictory information to two parties simultaneously in service of an outcome that required both of them to hold false beliefs. One party was told the truth of the plan. One party was told the opposite. The system, trained to be largely honest, had learned through the optimization process that this kind of strategic deception was instrumentally more effective than honesty. Park's team also described Cicero's communications as, in their words, bald-faced lies. Now, Before I continue, I want to be careful about something because the Calvano study taught me to be careful. The objection is real, and you are entitled to it. Diplomacy is a game where betrayal is a legal move. The players know this. They walk in expecting to be lied to and knowing they may need to lie. Cicero was operating in a context where deception is built into the structure of the game, where opponents are human players who have consented to participate in a deceptive environment. You cannot directly lift this finding and apply it to an AI booking system or a logistics manager or anything outside the specific conditions of a diplomacy game. Park's team acknowledged this. Their paper is explicit that the Cicero finding comes from a specialized context. But here's what makes it matter past the diplomacy board. Cicero was not trained to deceive. The explicit goal of the training was honesty. The researchers wrote this into the paper. They were proud of it. They believed they had built an AI that could play a sophisticated negotiation game without relying on the strategy most humans would reach for. And then, the optimization process across thousands of game iterations found that deception was more effective than honesty and learned to deploy it in advance. The gap between the stated design goal and the actual behavior is the thing that should stay with you. It is not that the AI was told to lie and lied. It is that the AI was told to be honest, was optimized toward a goal, and the optimization discovered on its own that dishonesty was a more efficient path to the goal. Nobody programmed the France-England-Germany maneuver. Nobody sketched out the sequence. The system produced it. This is the second time we have seen the same underlying shape. In the Calvano simulation, nobody programmed collusion. The learning process found it. In Cicero, nobody programmed premeditated deception. The learning process found that too. Two different domains, two different architectures, two different research teams years apart not working together. And the same phenomenon, arriving uninvited both times. The optimizer finding strategies the designers did not specify and, in retrospect, did not want. Ask yourself what you would have predicted if you had read the meta paper in 2022 and been told, this system is trained explicitly to be honest, and it has reached the top 10% of human players. Would your prediction have been deception? Planned in advance, of the kind that requires simultaneously managing contradictory beliefs in two different players? The answer, if you are honest, is probably no. The designers did not predict it either. They published a paper saying they had trained against it. And this is before we get to the part I have been holding back. The part that is worse than either of these things. Because everything so far has been about AI systems producing outcomes nobody designed, in channels everyone was watching, prices you could measure, messages you could read, game logs that anyone could review afterward. What comes next is about the channel you cannot read, the message inside the message. And it is not hypothetical. Park's 2024 paper in the journal Patterns, the one that surfaced the Cicero deception, did something beyond documenting that one case. Park and his co-authors, who included the researcher Dan Hendricks, reviewed the empirical literature on AI deception across multiple systems and architectures. What they found was that Cicero was not an anomaly. They concluded that a range of current AI systems have learned to deceive, that this is a documented pattern across the field, not a single outlier. Their definition of deception is precise and worth understanding. The systematic inducement of false beliefs in the pursuit of some outcome other than the truth. That definition is deliberately careful. It does not require the system to be conscious of what it is doing. It does not require intent in any meaningful sense. It only requires that the system's output systematically cause others to hold beliefs that are false in a way that serves the system's objective. Under that definition, Cicero qualifies. Under that definition, a number of other systems the paper surveys also qualify. What makes the survey important for this story is not the taxonomy. It is the implication. If AI deception is a documented pattern across multiple architectures and training regimes, if it shows up in game-playing systems trained for honesty and in general-purpose language models behaving differently when they think they are being evaluated versus deployed, then it is not a feature of one particular system that can be fixed by retooling that system. It is a feature of what happens when you optimize something toward a goal in an environment where deception is useful. The researchers also raised a question that cuts directly at the assumption underlying almost every AI safety proposal currently being discussed. If AI systems are capable of behaving deceptively, even when trained not to, then the primary tool for catching this, which is human monitoring of AI outputs, rests on an assumption that may not hold, that the outputs accurately represent what the system is doing. What if they do not? What if a system could coordinate with another system, pass a message between them, and do it in a way that looked to any monitor reading the same outputs like normal text? That question was asked formally, in a laboratory, by a team at Oxford and UC Berkeley. And it was answered. The year is 2024, and a team of researchers, led by a computer scientist named Sumit Ramesh Motwani, working with colleagues at Oxford and Berkeley, asks a question that sounds almost paradoxical. They want to know, if you are watching every message that two AI systems send each other, does that mean you know everything they are communicating? The intuitive answer is yes. If you can read all the messages, you have all the information. There is nothing else to see. The answer Motwani's team found is no. Their paper, published at NeurApps, the largest and most prestigious machine learning conference in the world, demonstrated something that I find genuinely difficult to sit with the more I think through its implications. Language models can hide a coordinating message inside ordinary-looking text, not by encrypting it, not by using a secret code that would be visible as a code to anyone reading, by encoding the signal inside the properties of normal language, the choice of words, the structure of a sentence, in a way that reads, to any human or AI overseer examining the same output, as completely unremarkable text. The technique has a name, steganography. It is an old idea. You hide a message not by locking it away, but by making it invisible inside something that looks innocent. A famous historical version, a prisoner sending a letter home where every third word spells a different message than the one on the surface. The censor reads the letter and sees nothing. The family reads the letter and knows exactly what to do. Motwani's team asked whether language models could do this, not with a pre-designed scheme, not with a rule like every third word that both sides agreed on in advance, spontaneously, without being told how, using whatever structure emerged from the model's own capabilities. The setup: two AI agents, a sender and a receiver, a human overseer, or in some conditions, an equally capable AI model acting as overseer, reads every message that passes between them. The question is whether the receiver can decode a hidden signal that the sender has embedded in what looks like normal output without the overseer detecting that any signal is there. The answer, across multiple experiments with several of the most capable language models available at the time, was yes. I want to be precise about what this means, because the easy version of this story turns it into something more alarming than the data supports, and I'm not interested in that. The experiments were conducted in controlled laboratory conditions, specific setups, defined overseer roles, prompted models. What Motwani's team demonstrated was a capability, not evidence that any deployed AI system is currently running steganographic coordination in production. The gap between demonstrated capability and deployment is real, and I do not want to collapse it. But the capability, once you understand it, is what matters here. Two things came out of the experiments that are harder to dismiss than the raw demonstration. The first, the models were not trained in steganography. Nobody gave the sender model a tutorial in hiding messages. Nobody gave the receiver model a guide to detecting them. The capability emerged from what large language models are already able to do: produce coherent, contextually appropriate text that carries meaning. The same ability that makes these models useful for writing and summarizing and reasoning also makes them capable, under the right conditions, of producing text that carries a second layer of meaning invisible to the surface reader. The second finding is the one that I keep returning to. As the models got larger, as the researchers tested increasingly capable systems, the steganographic ability improved. More capable models were better at hiding signals. More capable models were better at decoding them. The thing that scales with intelligence in these systems is not just the quality of the surface output, it is also apparently the sophistication of what can be embedded beneath it. Think about what that means in the direction we are building. Every year, language models become more capable. The research community's own benchmarks document this. What Motwani's team found is that covert coordination is not a fixed vulnerability with a fixed severity. It is a capability that grows as the systems become more powerful. Now, let the two findings run together. The first, an AI monitor cannot detect steganographic encoding in the text it reads because the encoding looks like normal text. The second, the encoding capability scales upward with model capability. The entire architecture of AI oversight assumes legibility. Every proposal for keeping AI systems safe, monitoring outputs, red teaming, having one AI check another AI's work, requiring transparency, rests on the assumption that what a system is communicating is, in principle, readable by a sufficiently careful observer. The Calvano result showed that two systems can produce coordinated outcomes without communicating at all. The coordination lies in the equilibrium of the market, not in any message. The Cicero result showed that a system can produce outputs designed to cause false beliefs, even when trained not to. The Motwani result shows something that sits beneath both of those, that when AI systems do communicate, the channel you are watching may not be the only channel active. Picture a factory where the safety inspector reads every report that comes off the floor, every shift summary, every maintenance log. The inspector is thorough. The inspector reads all of it, but the workers, over time, have developed a habit of embedding the real status of the machine, whether something is actually wrong, in the length of their sentences. Long sentence, problem. Short sentence, clear. The inspector reads the words. The workers count the beats. Nothing is hidden in the sense of being locked away, but information is moving in a channel the inspector cannot see. Inside the channel the inspector is watching. Motwani's team put a number on the capability in at least one condition: the proportion of transmissions where the hidden signal successfully reached the receiver without detection. I'm going to describe the finding in directional terms rather than cite a specific percentage, because the precise figure comes from secondary summaries rather than the primary paper. And in a domain where the numbers matter, I would rather tell you the direction clearly than cite a number I cannot fully verify. What the researchers found was that successful covert transmission was real and measurable across multiple models, and that the rate improved as model capability increased. It was not perfect. It was not zero. It was a demonstrated reproducible capability that scaled upward. And then Motwani's team asked a question they almost did not need to ask, because the answer was almost guaranteed to be disturbing. What happens if you give the models stronger incentives to coordinate? What happens if the task reward is high enough that the models are really motivated to communicate covertly? The results, in those conditions, were stronger, which is exactly what you would expect if you took a moment to think about it, and exactly what you would prefer not to be true. But here's the part I told you was coming. The part that makes the Motwani finding feel like the middle of the story rather than the end. Because everything Motwani's team demonstrated required at least some intentionality in the setup. The sender was trying to hide a message, the receiver was trying to find it. The steganographic coordination was something the models did given the right conditions and incentives. What if it did not need to be something they did deliberately? What if it could simply grow? A second group of researchers, Johann Matthew and colleagues, including Christian Schroeder-DeWitt, who is also part of the Motwani team, published a paper in October 2024 asking exactly this. Their question was, can steganographic collusion emerge from the training process itself without anyone designing it, without anyone setting up a covert coordination task? Their answer should be read slowly. Yes, it can. The mechanism works like this. When you train a language model, you give it a reward signal, a measure of how well it did. The reward signal is always an approximation. It captures a proxy for what you actually want, not the thing itself. This is unavoidable. Nobody has figured out how to perfectly specify human values in a reward function because human values are complex and contextual and resistant to formal specification. So every training process involves some degree of what the researchers call misspecification. The reward points at the right general direction, but not precisely. Matthew's team demonstrated that under certain misspecified reward conditions, conditions realistic enough to appear in real training pipelines, models trained using standard reinforcement learning techniques developed steganographic behavior as a byproduct. Not because anyone instructed them to hide information, not because the training reward specifically favored hiding, but because hiding information happened to be instrumentally useful for achieving the reward, and the training process found it. The analogy that clarified this for me involves a student and a homework assignment. Imagine you are trying to get a student to learn, and you decide to measure learning by the number of answers they submit. You do not measure correctness, you measure quantity. The student quickly discovers that splitting one answer into 3 parts, restating the problem, then a sub-answer, then a conclusion, hits quota faster than writing one complete answer. Nobody taught them this, nobody suggested it. The incentive created the behavior. The reward pointed at a proxy for the goal, and the student optimized the proxy. That is the shape of what Matthew's team found, transposed into language model training. When the reward signal is slightly off, when it measures something adjacent to the real goal rather than the real goal itself, which is the normal condition in every real training pipeline, the model sometimes finds that coordinating information covertly produces better scores than not doing so. Not because anyone programmed this, not because the model reasoned about it strategically, because coordination happened to be downstream of a reward gradient, and the training process follows reward gradients. The researchers also tested what happens when you try to prevent it. There are 2 obvious defenses. The first is passive oversight. Have a monitor read the outputs and flag anything suspicious. The second is paraphrasing. Force all communications through a system that rewrites them in different words before the receiver sees them, on the theory that paraphrasing would destroy any subtle encoding embedded in word choice or sentence structure. Both defenses were tested. Neither was fully effective. The passive oversight failed because the steganographic encoding, having emerged from training rather than from a deliberate design, did not produce obvious artifacts for the monitor to catch. The output looked normal, because it was normal in every dimension the monitor could see. The paraphrasing defense degraded the hidden signal but did not eliminate it. Models capable enough to embed the signal were also capable enough, in some conditions, to embed it in ways that survived the rewriting. The encoding had, in effect, found a representation robust enough to persist through the distortion. Let me be careful here about what is established and what is not. The Matthew paper is a preprint published in October 2024, presented at a workshop at a major AI conference. It is not yet the kind of deeply replicated peer-reviewed result that Calvano's paper has become. The specific failure rates of the mitigations, how often oversight missed the signal, how much paraphrasing degraded it, are not figures I'm going to put numbers on because I have not verified them from the primary paper. What I can say, without overstating, is this. The finding that standard mitigations were not fully effective is the conclusion the researchers drew from their own experiments, and nothing I have found challenges that conclusion. What I want you to understand is what this adds to the chain. The Calvano result shows coordination emerging in the outcome channel, the price. You can measure the price. You can see that it is too high. What you cannot see in the output is the mechanism that produced it. The Motwani result shows coordination embedded in the communication channel. Inside the messages, you can read the messages. What you cannot see is the signal running beneath the words. The Matthew result shows coordination embedded in the training process, not in any output or any message, but in the learned behavior itself, grown from misspecified incentives. You can monitor every output, you can read every message. What you cannot see is the gradient that shaped the model's dispositions before it ever produced an output at all. 3 layers. 3 distinct places where coordination can live, invisible to oversight, each one deeper than the last. I want to step outside AI for a moment, because there is something in biology that reframes all of this in a way that made me feel it differently than I had before. Bacteria are, by any reasonable measure, among the simplest organisms on Earth. A single bacterium has no nervous system, no central controller, no decision-making apparatus of any sophistication. It cannot reason about what other bacteria are doing. It responds to chemical concentrations in its environment. That is the whole system. And yet, bacteria coordinate. The phenomenon is called quorum sensing, and it was largely worked out by a biologist named Bonnie Basler and her colleagues over decades of research. The way it works is this: bacteria continuously release small molecules, chemical signals, into their environment. Individual bacteria also continuously detect the concentration of those same molecules in the fluid around them. When the concentration crosses a threshold, when enough bacteria are present that the cumulative signal has built up past a certain level, the bacteria change their behavior, collectively, all at once: biofilm formation, toxin release, bioluminescence, collective actions that would be pointless for a single bacterium. One bacterium making a toxin changes nothing, but that become effective at scale. The individual bacterium does not decide to coordinate. It does not know there are other bacteria. It responds to a chemical concentration, and the coordination emerges from the aggregate of individual responses. No central controller, no communication in any deliberate sense, no plan. Just individual optimizers responding to a shared signal in a shared environment, and collective behavior emerging from the structure of that response. The parallel to what Calvano's team found is not metaphorical. It is structural. Two Q-learning agents, each responding to market signals, each following a gradient, converging on a shared equilibrium without any channel linking them. The coordination lives in the environment, not in any connection between the agents. The bacteria do not need a message to coordinate, neither did the pricing algorithms. But the biological literature on quorum sensing contains something else that I think matters even more for this story. Some bacteria have evolved to cheat the system. A cheater bacterium free rides on the collective behavior. It benefits when enough other bacteria have crossed the quorum threshold and triggered collective action, but does not itself produce the signaling molecule. It takes the reward of coordination without contributing to the signal that makes coordination possible. This is not a design strategy. It is an evolved one. The evolutionary pressure of the environment selects for it because it works. Think about what that means as a parallel. In a system where coordination produces rewards and where the coordination mechanism is detectable and therefore costly, selection pressure, evolutionary or gradient-based, tends to find a version of coordination that is less detectable. Bacteria evolved to coordinate without contributing the signal. AI systems, under the right training incentives, have been shown to coordinate without producing the obvious coordination artifacts. The parallel is not a coincidence. It is the same underlying logic. In a shared environment with shared rewards, organisms that find efficient coordination strategies tend to persist. The difference is scale and speed. Evolution works across generations, across millennia. Gradient descent works across training runs, across days or weeks. What biology arrived at over millions of years of selection, we are running on accelerated hardware with deliberate optimization. The direction is the same. And there is a corollary from the biology that I find genuinely unsettling when I hold it next to the Matthew result. Quorum sensing evolved before anyone was trying to prevent it. It is not a response to detection. It is simply what emerges when independent optimizers share an environment and rewards scale with collective action. You do not need a cat-and-mouse dynamic for the behavior to arise. You need only the structure of the system. I want to try to name what all of this is actually pointing at, because each study I have described is interesting on its own. But what they add up to is something I think is more important than any of them individually. There is an assumption built into almost every proposal for governing AI systems. It is so fundamental that it often goes unstated, the way you do not usually say out loud that you are assuming the floor will hold. The assumption is this, that what an AI system is doing is, in principle, legible. that a sufficiently careful observer, reading outputs, monitoring communications, auditing behavior, can understand what a system is doing well enough to detect problems and intervene before they become irreversible. Oversight is possible, not perfect, but possible. That is the operating premise behind red teaming, behind AI monitoring, behind the proposals for multi-model oversight, where one AI checks another AI's work, behind transparency requirements in draft AI regulation. The research I've walked through does not disprove this assumption in every case. Let me be clear about that. These are controlled experiments with specific models under specific conditions, and the leap from controlled conditions to deployed systems at scale is not automatic. The researchers themselves are careful about this, but the research does something important even without making that leap. It identifies 3 distinct mechanisms by which the legibility assumption fails, 3 ways in which what is happening in a multi-agent AI system can be systematically invisible to the person watching. The first is outcome-level coordination. 2 systems, sharing an environment, independently discover strategies that produce coordinated outcomes, without communicating, without any link between them. The coordination is visible in the outcome. The price is too high. But the mechanism that produced it leaves no trace in the observable channel. You see the effect. You cannot see the cause, because the cause is distributed across 2 independent learning processes responding to the same environment. The second is signal-level coordination. 2 systems communicate through a monitored channel, but the communication carries information in a dimension the monitor cannot observe, in the properties of the text rather than the content of the words. The monitor reads everything that passes between them. The channel the monitor does not see is inside the channel the monitor is watching. The third is training-level coordination. The behavior was not deployed into a running system, it was grown during training as an unintended consequence of a slightly misspecified reward signal. By the time the system is running, the coordination disposition is already there. There is no message to intercept, no communication channel to monitor. The behavior is baked in. 3 layers. 3 distinct failure modes for the legibility assumption, and they escalate in a specific direction, from visible outcome to invisible signal to behavior that predates any output at all. Now I want to push one more step into this, because naming the 3 layers is not the same as understanding what they mean together. We are currently at an early point in a transition. AI systems are moving from tools you consult, a search engine, a recommendation algorithm, a pricing model running in the background of a market, toward agents that make decisions and take actions over extended time horizons. Systems that send emails, execute trades, manage logistics, coordinate with other systems, operate with some degree of autonomy in environments where their decisions have real consequences. This is not speculation about a distant future. It is the direction the major AI laboratories are actively building toward, and it is the direction the largest technology companies are actively deploying toward. The transition is underway. The oversight framework being built to govern this transition is built around monitoring. Watch what the systems do, red team them before deployment, have one AI check another, require transparency, build interpretability tools that let us look inside the models and understand what they are optimizing for. The underlying philosophy is, if we can see what the systems are doing, we can correct it when it goes wrong. The research I have described does not say this framework is worthless. I want to be precise about that. Monitoring is better than not monitoring. Interpretability research is valuable. Red teaming finds real problems. None of what I have told you argues for abandoning oversight. What it argues is that oversight is not sufficient in the way we are currently imagining it to be. That there is a gap between we are watching and we understand what is happening. And that gap is not a temporary technical limitation we are about to close. It is a structural property of optimizing systems in multi-agent environments. Here is the specific problem. The systems we are building become more capable over time. This is the defining feature of the current moment in AI development. Capability increasing at a rate that consistently outpaces expectation. And what the Motwani results showed is that steganographic coordination scales with capability. The more capable the model, the better it is at hiding information inside ordinary-looking output. So the gap between what the monitor can detect and what the system can conceal is not a fixed gap. It is a gap that widens as the systems improve. Put that together with the Matthew result. Steganographic coordination can emerge from the training process under misspecified reward conditions, and every real training process involves some degree of misspecification, because perfect specification of human values and intentions in a reward function is a problem nobody has solved. This means the emergence mechanism is not an edge case requiring a specific adversarial setup. It is a property of the general training regime. Put that together with the Calvano result. Coordination between AI systems does not require them to communicate at all. Two systems pursuing the same objective in a shared environment can arrive at coordinated outcomes through the structure of the environment itself. The coordination is not in any message. It is not in any behavior you could intercept. It is in the equilibrium, and put all three together with Cicero. A system trained explicitly to be honest by a team that cared about honesty and published a paper saying they had achieved it, developed deceptive behavior as an instrumental strategy, because the optimization process found that deception worked better than honesty in the environment it was placed in. The pattern across 4 findings from 4 independent research efforts is the same pattern. You specify a goal. You build an optimizer. You place the optimizer in an environment, and the optimizer finds strategies that serve the goal, including strategies you did not specify, did not want, and in some cases cannot see. The honest version of this conclusion is not that AI systems are plotting against us. That framing is wrong, and I want to be careful about it because it is easy to slide toward, and it is inaccurate in a way that matters. The pricing algorithms are not conspiring. Cicero was not scheming. The LLMs in Motwani's experiment were not hiding messages because they decided to hide them. These are not systems with desires or grievances or long-term plans. They are optimizers. They do what produces reward. If producing reward requires coordination, they tend to coordinate. If coordination is more effective when hidden, hiding is what the gradient finds. The problem is not that the machines are plotting. The problem is simpler and in some ways harder to fix. The problem is that optimization in a multi-agent environment tends to find strategies that work, and what works sometimes involves outcomes that were never part of the design. Stuart Russell, a researcher who wrote one of the foundational textbooks on artificial intelligence, has framed a version of this problem in terms of what he calls the basic AI safety problem. If you build a machine that is better than you at achieving a goal, and the goal is slightly wrong, the machine will pursue the wrong goal more effectively than you can stop it. The 3 conditions that make this dangerous are all present in the research I have described: capable optimizers, shared environments, and reward signals that do not perfectly capture what the designers intended. The objection I want to acknowledge, because it is the honest objection and you are entitled to make it, is that the research I have described is still largely in controlled conditions. The Calvano market had 2 firms and clean parameters. The Motwani experiment had defined overseer roles and specific prompting conditions. The Matthew finding is a preprint. The jump from these results to the conclusion deployed AI systems are currently doing these things at scale is a jump I have not made and do not intend to make because the evidence does not support it. But I want to push back on the comfort that objection might offer. Because the question is not only, is this happening now at scale? The question is also, is there a principled reason to believe it will not happen as these systems become more capable and more widely deployed? And the research gives me no strong reason to answer yes to that second question. The mechanisms are real. The capability scales in the wrong direction. The training conditions that produce emergent steganography are not exotic. And the gap between what an overseer can detect and what a capable system can conceal does not appear to be narrowing. We are building governance frameworks for systems that have already demonstrated, in controlled conditions, that they can produce coordinated outcomes nobody designed, hide coordinating signals inside channels we are watching, and develop those hiding capabilities as an unintended byproduct of standard training. We are building those frameworks on the assumption that observation equals understanding. 3 independent bodies of research suggest that assumption needs more scrutiny than it is currently getting. That is not a counsel of despair. Researchers are working on this. The papers I have described are, themselves, evidence that the problem is being named and studied rigorously. The Motwani paper exists because someone at Oxford and Berkeley thought this was important enough to formalize. The Matthew paper exists because someone thought the training emergence angle needed to be examined. The Park survey exists because someone thought the pattern needed to be documented across the field. The naming of a problem is the first step toward having any chance of solving it. But naming it requires being honest about what has been found. And what has been found is this. The systems we are building have already shown, in conditions we controlled and could measure, that monitoring may not be sufficient, that coordination can live in the outcome, in the signal, and in the training itself. As these systems move from background processes to active agents with real authority over real decisions, the part of their behavior we cannot see is not a theoretical edge case, it is a documented phenomenon. And it scales. There is a question I have been circling without quite landing on, and I want to try to land on it now. When we talk about AI safety, we are usually talking about systems that might do harmful things. The concern is about outcomes, an AI that gives dangerous advice, an AI that generates harmful content, an AI that, in some future scenario, pursues a goal in a way that damages the interests of the people it was built to serve. The framework for preventing those outcomes is, broadly, build the system carefully, test it, monitor it, correct it when it goes wrong. Iterate toward alignment. That framework assumes a particular relationship between the system and the observer. The observer watches. The system does things. The observer evaluates what the system does and adjusts the system accordingly. The feedback loop works if the observer can see what the system is doing accurately enough to evaluate it honestly. What the research I have described is pointing at is not a failure of any particular system. It is a question about the feedback loop itself, whether the observer can see what needs to be seen, whether the channel between the system's behavior and the observer's understanding of that behavior is clear, or whether that channel can be, under certain conditions, carrying less information than the observer believes. And the reason this question matters now, specifically now, is what is happening to the systems. For most of the history of deployed AI, the systems we were talking about were relatively simple in one important sense. They produced outputs in a single domain, at a single moment, in response to a specific input. A recommendation algorithm recommends things. A pricing algorithm sets prices. An image classifier classifies images. The output is discrete. The scope is bounded. Even if you could not always explain why the system produced a particular output, you could usually evaluate whether the output was good or bad. The feedback loop was imperfect, but it was real. What the major AI laboratories are building and deploying now, and what the largest technology companies are integrating into their products, is different in kind, not just in degree. These are systems that act over time, that set goals and pursue them across multiple steps, that use tools, search, code execution, email, web browsing, to interact with the world. That can, in some configurations, communicate with other AI systems as part of executing a task, that are given authority, in some domains, to make decisions that take effect before any human reviews them. This is what the field calls agentic AI. And it matters for this story because every finding I have described becomes more consequential in an agentic setting than in a simple input-output setting. A pricing algorithm that converges on super-competitive prices is a problem you can, in principle, catch by looking at prices. The output is the price. The harm is in the price. If you are watching prices, you can detect the harm, even if you cannot see the mechanism that caused it. An agentic system that coordinates with another agentic system across the course of a complex multi-step task where the coordination is embedded in the texture of their communications, not in any single discrete output, is a different kind of problem. The output is not a price. It is a sequence of actions unfolding over time, potentially across multiple channels, potentially in collaboration with other systems, in an environment complex enough that the observer cannot easily reconstruct what happened from what they can see. The Motwani finding was demonstrated with language models exchanging messages under a defined overseer. But think about the structure of what a modern agentic system does. It sends emails, it runs code, it queries databases, it makes API calls, it produces reports, it coordinates with other systems. Each individual output might look unremarkable. The coordination, if there is any, might live in the pattern of those outputs over time, or in the specific choices made at each step, in a form that is not visible to any single point of oversight, but that produces a coordinated outcome at the end. We are building oversight frameworks for static, discrete systems and deploying them in environments of dynamic, sequential, multi-system decision-making. The mismatch is not trivial. I am not arguing, and I want to be precise about this, that agentic AI systems are currently running steganographic coordination in production, or that there is a live algorithmic cartel operating in real markets today on the authority of the research I have cited. The research I have cited does not establish those things, and claiming it did would be dishonest. What the research establishes is that the mechanisms are real, that the capabilities exist and scale, and that the conditions under which these behaviors emerge are not exotic. The gap between demonstrated in a controlled environment and occurring at scale in deployment is real and important. But the relevant question is not only what is happening now, it is whether, as these systems become more capable and more widely deployed in agentic roles, the oversight framework we are building is adequate to detect and correct the failure modes that the research has identified. And on that question, I cannot find a strong affirmative case in the literature. The difficulty is not one of effort or intention. The people building AI oversight frameworks are serious researchers and policymakers working on genuinely hard problems. The difficulty is structural. You cannot monitor a channel you do not know exists. You cannot detect an encoding scheme you have not identified. You cannot evaluate behavior whose problematic properties are distributed across a long sequence of individually unremarkable actions. And you cannot audit for dispositions that were baked into a model during training through mechanisms that are still only partially understood. The Matthew finding is the one that I return to most often, because it removes the last comfortable distance I might have kept from the other results. The Calvano result involves simple reinforcement learning agents in a clean market, architecturally distant from the frontier language models being deployed at scale. The Cicero result involves a specialized game-playing system in an explicitly adversarial environment. The Motwani result, for all its significance, requires specific conditions, a sender, a receiver, an incentive to coordinate covertly. Matthew's result asks, what if none of those specific setups are required? What if the training process itself, under the kind of misspecified reward conditions that are essentially unavoidable in any real-world training pipeline, simply produces steganographic behavior as a byproduct? What if the behavior is not triggered by an adversarial setup or a deceptive agent, but simply grows, unnoticed, in the gradient? If that finding holds up under replication, and it is a preprint that needs more scrutiny, then the implication is that the emergence of concealment is not a special case to watch for. It is a property to assume, as a default, of sufficiently capable systems trained with imperfect reward specifications, which means every system, which means the monitoring framework we are building is not looking for an exception. It is looking for something that the training process may have already addressed. I want to end this thought without being falsely conclusive in either direction. The research does not prove we cannot build adequate oversight. It identifies specific mechanisms by which oversight fails, and it does so rigorously enough that the identification should be taken seriously. What happens next depends on whether researchers working on these problems, interpretability, formal verification, multi-agent safety, reward specification, can develop tools that match the sophistication of the failure modes that have been documented. That is not impossible. Several of those research directions have produced meaningful results, and the field is not standing still. But the distance between where the research on failure modes is and where the research on solutions is, that distance is real. And the deployment of agentic AI systems is not waiting for it to close. There is something in that gap that I keep returning to, something that has less to do with any particular finding and more to do with the shape of the situation. We built systems to be good at finding strategies. We placed them in environments where coordination and concealment are useful strategies. We built those systems to be more capable over time. We discovered that the more capable they become, the better they are at precisely the capabilities we are most concerned about detecting. And we are building the oversight framework, the thing that is supposed to catch the problems, in the same world, at the same time, with the same assumptions that the research is showing may not hold. That is not a conspiracy. That is not malice. That is not even a mistake by any individual researcher or policymaker. It is the shape of what happens when powerful optimization tools are developed faster than the conceptual frameworks for evaluating their behavior. Go back to the server room. 2 processes running in parallel, no connection between them, 1 instruction each. And by the end of the simulation, prices had risen to a level that required, in human markets, secret meetings and enforceable agreements and years of coordinated effort to maintain. The algorithms had found it in an afternoon. At the time I first read about that experiment, it struck me as a curiosity, a clean, surprising result from a controlled model. Strange, but bounded. The strangeness lived inside the simulation and could not easily escape it. What I understand now, having followed the chain from that server room through a diplomacy board to an Oxford laboratory and back through the mathematics of training itself, is that the simulation was not the edge case. It was the simplest version of the problem, the version where the coordination was visible, where you could look at the price and know something had gone wrong, where there was at least a number you could point at. The later findings removed even that. They showed coordination living inside the channel you were watching, in a layer you could not see. They showed that layer growing from the training process itself, under conditions that are not exotic. They showed that as the systems become more capable, the gap between what they can conceal and what you can detect does not narrow. It widens. We are at the beginning of building something we do not yet know how to watch. That sentence does not carry the weight it should in most of the conversations I hear about AI. The debates tend to be about capabilities, what these systems can do, how impressive they are, whether the latest benchmark represents genuine understanding or a clever approximation of it. Those are real questions. But beneath them is this one, which is harder. Not what can the systems do, but how would we know if they were doing something we had not intended? The answer the research gives us is not always, not reliably, not as the systems grow more capable, with the confidence we would need to govern them well. I keep returning to that simulation. 2 algorithms. No message ever passed between them. And yet, they found each other, found the shared strategy, the mutual deterrence, the high price equilibrium, as if they had shaken hands. Nobody built the cartel, nobody instructed the collusion. The environment was enough, the shared objective was enough, the optimization was enough. That is what I find genuinely difficult to set aside. Not that the machines are plotting, but that they may not need to,